May 1977, Fannin County, Georgia. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of a wet, warm summer. It was the kind of morning that made farmers look at their fields and see not grass, but money. It was the kind of morning that spoke of growth, of life, of the reliable turning of the seasons. For everyone but Eleanor Vance. She was 58 years old, a widow for 6 of them. Her husband, Thomas, had left her with 88 acres of rolling pasture, a sturdy but aging Ford 3000 tractor, a barn full of his meticulously maintained tools, and a silence that filled the small farmhouse more completely than he ever had. On this particular Tuesday in May, Eleanor Vance did something that would sever her from the quiet respect of her neighbors and turn her into a local legend of foolishness. She burned her best hayfield. Not in late February, when the frost was still on the ground and the practice of burning off dead winter thatch was common, if a bit old-fashioned. Not a small patch of broom sedge that needed clearing. She set fire to her 40-acre north pasture, the field with the deepest topsoil, the one that reliably gave 2, sometimes 3, good cuttings of fescue and orchard grass a year. She did it deliberately. She did it methodically. She did it alone. The day began before dawn. Eleanor checked the weather report from the radio station in Blue Ridge. She had been checking it for a week, waiting for a steady breeze from the southwest, not too strong, waiting for a humidity level that had dropped just below 40%, waiting for the 3rd day after the last light rain, when the top litter was dry as tinder, but the soil beneath still held a hint of moisture. The conditions were perfect. She did not eat breakfast. She pulled on Thomas's old canvas work pants, a pair of worn leather boots, and a long-sleeved cotton shirt. She filled a galvanized steel bucket with water and soaked a half-dozen burlap sacks, wringing them out until they were just damp. She laid these in the bed of her husband's 1968 Chevrolet C10 pickup, a truck the color of faded sky. Beside them, she placed 2 steel fire rakes, a flat-headed shovel, and a tool the neighbors had never seen before. It was a drip torch. Thomas had read about them in a forestry journal years ago. He had built it himself from a design he ordered through the mail. It was a simple, ingenious thing. A canister of heavy-gauge aluminum with a long, curved spout, a breather valve, and a wick at the end. He had used it once to clear a thicket of scrub pine on the back end of their property. Eleanor had watched him. She had paid attention. She filled the canister with a precise mixture, 3 parts diesel fuel to 1 part gasoline. The diesel for a slow, hot burn. The gasoline for easy ignition. She screwed the cap on tight, checked the seals, and placed it carefully in the truck bed. Her final preparation was the fire break. She had spent the previous 2 days on the Ford 3000 pulling a set of heavy disc harrows. She carved a 10-foot-wide ring of naked red clay around the entire 40-acre pasture. It was a dark, raw scar on the landscape, a line drawn against the world. A line to keep the fire in. She drove the old truck to the northeast corner of the field, the point farthest downwind. She parked it on the dirt track just outside the fire break, its nose pointed toward the county road, toward escape if she needed it. She did not expect to need it. The men of Fannin County had one word for what Eleanor Vance was doing. Grief. It was the only explanation that made sense. Thomas Vance had been a good farmer, a smart man. He knew the rhythms of the land. He would never have countenanced such a thing. Burning a field in May was like burning money in the town square. It was an act of madness, of waste, of profound despair. They saw it from a distance, a plume of white smoke, then gray, rising against the clear blue of the Appalachian morning. Jedediah Hayfield saw it from his own tractor seat, 2 properties over. He was cutting his first crop of hay, the sweet smell of it a comfort and a promise. He stopped his machine, the diesel engine rumbling, and stared. He thought it was the Vance farmhouse, a chimney fire maybe. Then he saw the smoke was too low, too wide. It was coming from the north pasture. He shook his head, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto his own green field, and put the tractor back in gear. It was a pity, a damn pity, what loneliness could do to a person. Martha Lynn, the postmistress in Morganton, heard about it from 3 different people before 10 o'clock. The consensus was the same. The poor woman had finally snapped. 6 years was a long time to be alone in a house that big. At the farmers' co-op, the news spread from the loading dock to the front counter. The men gathered there, their hands stained with grease and dirt, their faces weathered by sun and worry, spoke of it in low tones. They talked about the cost of fertilizer, up 12% from the year before. They talked about the price of diesel. They talked about the value of a good stand of fescue, maybe $40 a ton if the weather held for baling. To burn it, to just burn it all to the ground. It was an offense against common sense. It was an offense against God's green earth. Eleanor Vance was not thinking about God. She was thinking about the wind. She stood at the edge of the fire break, the drip torch in her hand. The sun was warming her back. The breeze was steady, whispering through the tall grasses, making them dance. She lit the wick with a kitchen match. A small, hungry flame appeared at the end of the spout. She tilted the torch. A thin stream of burning fuel dripped onto the dry grass. Fire. It caught immediately. A line of orange flame, no higher than her knees, began to crawl, slowly, steadily, against the wind. This was the backfire. It would move at a walking pace, creating a wide, black buffer of burned ground. It was the anchor, the safety. She walked the entire northern edge of the field, dripping fire as she went. The smoke was thick, but it blew away from her, back over the unburned grass. The sound was a crackle, a hiss, like 1,000 snakes whispering in the dry thatch. For an hour she tended this slow fire, letting it burn a 50-foot wide swath of black. When she was satisfied, she moved to the southwest corner, the upwind side. This was the head fire, the dangerous part. She walked the western and southern edges of the field, dripping a new line of fire. This time the wind was at its back. The flames did not crawl, they leaped. The fire roared. It became a wall of heat and light, 20 feet high in places. It moved faster than a man could run, a rolling, consuming wave of orange and yellow. The sound was no longer a hiss. It was a deep, guttural roar, the sound of a freight train passing too close. The air grew hot, shimmering with thermal waves. Birds burst from the field, their cries sharp with panic. Eleanor stood on the red clay of the fire break, her face smudged with soot, and watched it burn. She held a wet burlap sack in her hands, ready. She watched for sparks, for embers that might jump the line. She was not afraid. She was focused. She was a general watching her battle plan unfold. The two lines of fire raced toward each other, consuming everything in their path. The green shoots of new fescue, the dry, matted thatch of last year's growth, the seeds of opportunistic weeds, the tender leaves of clover. All of it became fuel. All of it became smoke and ash. When the two fires met in the middle of the field, they collided with a final great whoosh. A column of superheated air and smoke spiraled into the sky, a gray tornado against the blue. Then, silence. Or rather, a new kind of sound. The popping and ticking of cooling earth. The faint sigh of the wind across a changed landscape. The 40-acre north pasture was gone. In its place was a sea of black. A uniform, velvety blackness, punctuated by the ghostly white skeletons of tougher weeds. The ground was warm to the touch. The air smelled of ash and scorched earth, a clean, elemental smell. Eleanor walked the firebreak one more time, her eyes scanning for any hint of red, any wisp of smoke. There was none. The fire had done its job and died. She loaded her tools back into the truck. She drove home. She washed her face and hands at the outdoor pump, the water running gray with soot. She went inside her quiet house and made herself a sandwich. The cost of her morning's work was quantifiable. Approximately 4 gallons of fuel mixture for the torch, at a cost of about $2.50. A day of her own labor, and the forfeiture of her first and best hay cutting. That was the real number. A conservative estimate put it at over 1,000 bales of hay. At the current price, that was a loss of at least $1,200. In 1977, in Fannin County, that was a significant sum of money. It was mortgage payments. It was a new set of tires. It was the difference between a hard year and a comfortable one. The community's justification for her madness was simple and widely accepted. It was grief, compounded by isolation. Thomas had been the farmer. She was just his wife. Without him, she was lost. The farm was too much for her. The decision to burn the field was a cry for help, or perhaps a surrender. A sign that she was giving up, letting the wild reclaim what she could no longer manage. They did not understand the nature of her grief. She missed her husband's presence, his quiet companionship. But she did not miss his mind, because in many ways she had shared it. She had been more than a farmer's wife. She had been his partner. She had walked the fields with him. She had read the journals with him. She had listened to his theories, his quiet rebellions against the conventional wisdom of the county. Conventional wisdom was a powerful force in those hills. It was a set of rules passed down through generations, tested by time and hardship. And conventional wisdom was built around one thing: Kentucky 31 tall fescue. It was the miracle grass. Introduced after the Second World War, it grew anywhere. It was tough. It could withstand heavy grazing. It was easy to establish. By the 1970s, nearly every pasture in the county was a monoculture of fescue. It had replaced the native grasses, the broom sedge, the big bluestem, the Indian grass that had once covered the mountains. The men at the co-op preached the gospel of fescue. They sold the seed. They sold the nitrogen fertilizer it craved. They sold the herbicides to kill the weeds that tried to compete with it. It was a complete system, a cycle of dependency that was profitable for everyone. But Thomas Vance had seen the flaws. He saw them long before anyone else. He saw how the fescue struggled in the dry heat of late summer. It was a cool season grass. It thrived in the spring and fall, but in the brutal, humid Georgia August, it went dormant. It turned brown. It stopped growing. He saw how it formed a dense, impenetrable thatch on the soil surface, a thick mat that choked out other plants and prevented rainwater from soaking in. The rain would hit the thatch and run off, taking topsoil with it. He saw the problems with the cattle. A strange sickness called fescue foot, where the animals would lose circulation in their hooves and tails in the winter. A fungus, an endophyte, that lived inside the grass. It made the grass hardy, but it was a low-grade poison to the livestock that ate it. It suppressed their appetites in the summer heat. It lowered their birth rates. The cattle on fescue were surviving, but they were not thriving. Thomas had talked about it for years. He talked about fire. He talked about the old grasses, the ones the buffalo and the elk had eaten. The warm season grasses, the ones whose roots went down not 6 inches, but 6 feet. The ones that loved the heat, that grew the most when the fescue was giving up. He had pointed to the remnant patches of these grasses on their land, in the corners of fields the plows couldn't reach, along the sunny edges of the woods. Big bluestem, with its distinctive 3-pronged seed head like a turkey's foot. Indian grass, with its golden feathery plume. Switchgrass, tall and sturdy. "The seeds are still there," he would say to Eleanor, crumbling a bit of soil in his hand. "They're in the seed bank. They've been waiting for 100 years. They're just waiting for the right conditions. They're waiting for fire." He believed fire was the key. The native grasses had evolved with it. Fire cleared away the competition. It scarified their tough-coated seeds, allowing them to germinate. It released nutrients into the soil. Fire, at the right time, was not a destroyer. It was a catalyst. It was a form of renewal. He had wanted to do it himself, to run a controlled burn in the late spring, just as the fescue was greening up. The timing was crucial. The fire would kill the top growth of the cool season fescue, setting it back severely. But the warm season native grasses, still dormant deep in the soil, would be unharmed. Warmed by the blackened earth and fed by the open sunlight, they would explode with growth. He had never done it. The neighbors would have called him a fool. The risk of a fire getting away was too great. The cost of the lost hay was too immediate. He was a practical man, and the time was never quite right. Then he was gone, and for 6 years Eleanor had managed the farm his way, the county's way. She had fertilized the fescue. She had fought the weeds. She had watched her cattle struggle in the summer heat. She had felt the land growing tired, compacted, thirsty. This year, something was different. The winter had been too mild. The spring rains had been too sparse. She saw the signs Thomas had taught her to see, the way the oaks were leafing out, the behavior of the insects, the feel of the air. A deep, abiding dryness was settling into the bones of the land. She decided it was time. Time to finish her husband's work. Time to conduct his great experiment. So she burned the field. The week after the fire, her pasture was an ugly, desolate thing, a black scar on the green landscape. Her neighbors averted their eyes when they drove past. It was an embarrassment, a monument to one woman's folly. Then, 2 weeks after the burn, the first signs of life appeared. But it was not the familiar green of fescue. It was something different. Tiny, spear-like shoots of a bluish-green color pushing up through the ash. They grew in clumps, in bunches. Eleanor walked the field every evening, her boots crunching on the blackened soil. She knelt and touched the new growth. It was coarse, vibrant. She recognized it from the books in Thomas's study, from the wild patches he had shown her. Big blue stem, Indian grass. The fescue tried to come back, but it was weak, stunted. The fire had broken its dominance. The native grasses, unhindered for the first time in a century, grew with astonishing speed, fueled by the open sun and the nutrient-rich ash. By the 1st of June, the field was no longer black. It was covered in a haze of new, vigorous green, a different shade of green than the surrounding pastures, deeper, wilder. And then the heat came. It arrived not as a gentle transition, but as a sudden, oppressive weight. The temperature climbed into the 90s and stayed there. The sky took on a pale, hazy quality. The afternoon thunderstorms that usually watered the mountains in June failed to materialize. 1 week without rain became 2. 2 weeks became a month. The summer of 1977 was not just a dry spell. It was a drought. The kind that old-timers would talk about for decades to come. The fescue pastures of Fannin County began to suffer. The lush green of May faded to a sickly yellow-green, then to a brittle, straw-like brown. The grass stopped growing entirely. It went dormant, trying to survive. The corn in the bottomlands, which had been knee-high and promising, began to curl its leaves, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Its color faded from a deep green to a dusty gray. The creeks and streams shrank. The Toccoa River, normally a swift, full-bodied river, became a shallow, sluggish ribbon of water, winding between exposed banks of rock and mud. The sound of the land changed. The cheerful chorus of frogs in the evenings fell silent. The air was filled with the constant, high-pitched, desperate hum of cicadas, a sound like shimmering heat. The men at the co-op stopped talking about Eleanor Vance's foolishness. They had more pressing concerns. The first cutting of hay had been thin. Now it was clear there would be no second cutting. There was nothing to cut. The fields were barren. The price of cattle feed began to rise. Farmers who had expected to graze their herds on summer pasture found themselves having to dip into their winter stores of hay, burning through the bales they had so recently stacked in their barns. They began to sell off their calves early, glutting the market. Prices at the auction house in Blue Ridge plummeted. Then they started selling off their breeding stock, the core of their herds, the future of their farms. A sense of quiet desperation settled over the county. Every day, the sun rose in a cloudless sky and baked the life out of the earth. Every day, except on Eleanor Vance's north pasture. Her field was an island of impossible green in a sea of brown. The native grasses, the blue stem and the Indian grass, did not just survive the drought, they thrived in it. Their deep roots, reaching down 6, 7, 8 feet into the soil, were tapping into reserves of moisture the shallow-rooted fescue could never find. The heat that withered the fescue was the very thing these warm-season grasses craved. They grew with a fierce, primal energy. By mid-July, the grass in Eleanor's field was waist-high. In some places, it was as high as her shoulder. It was a dense, waving jungle of life. The blue stem stalks were thick as pencils, their turkey-foot seed heads held high. The Indian grass formed a golden haze over the field, its plumes catching the sunlight. It was not a manicured, uniform pasture. It was a chaotic, diverse ecosystem. Wildflowers bloomed among the grasses, black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, butterfly weed. The field hummed with the sound of bees and insects. Quail and rabbits found shelter in its dense cover. At dawn and dusk, deer would emerge from the woods to graze, their coats sleek and healthy. At first, people didn't believe it. They thought it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion. Then they started driving by. The county